today we're going to look at a new application of price theory, but not any new algebra. We're going to use the model that Murphy talked about this week, which is in chapter 11. And we're going to just change the interpretation of the variables in that model to address a new question. And that's the type of exercise we do a lot in price theory. We have a couple models. We get good at them, and we found that those models apply into a huge variety of situations. Often we surprise ourselves at what we can do with the old model. Now, normally we think, in terms of price regulation, we think, well, supply and demand, it tells us about the price and the quantity of a particular good that has fixed characteristics. But one of the things that we can do, you'll see today, is we can look with the supply and demand model at how the product changes as market conditions change. And we'll also have a good illustration of what Murphy keeps talking about, the gains from trade. Gains from trade are going to feature big in terms of how we're using this model. Now, you might think that in the United States and other developed countries that the government doesn't set prices. That's like a Soviet thing, that if you're interested in Soviet studies, you might be interested in that, but for our economies, we don't need that. That's wrong. I've given several examples here. There are lots of price controls, say in the US economy, particularly in healthcare and labor markets, but also in finance and other areas. And what I've listed a number of them here. I've distinguished floors from ceilings. So the floor would be a price regulation dictating a minimum. It's illegal to take the price below, and then a ceiling would be a maximum. Now, one of the discouraging things about these regulations, particularly when I was working in the government, regulators, a lot of them have economics PhDs. But the frustrating thing here is we don't teach about price regulations in graduate school. So everybody in the government with their PhDs just winging it with what they learned in undergrad. And what we're going to see today is what you learned in undergrad is wrong. I'll let you decide if it's right or wrong, but it will be questioned. So I'm going to show examples from two textbooks, undergrad textbooks. I don't mean to pick on these two because their presentation is universal, essentially universal in economics courses. Now, the chart on the left here is the unregulated market. So that's kind of the baseline. And we want to think about what are the effective price controls. We compare the outcome to what's on the left. On the right is the outcome with a price control. What do we see happens as we move from left to right? Well, one thing is that the quantity goes down. I'm going to come back to that. The thing I want us to highlight first is what's going on with the surplus. So you see that huge consumer surplus that supposedly happens when you put on a price ceiling. And one of the reasons why it's so huge in the picture is it's been assumed that only the high value buyers are in the market. I've circled them in red. If you think of the demand curve as different people, as we do sometimes, only the high value buyers are in the market, and the lower value buyers are not in the market. And I've labeled that as miraculous. The books don't explain how they just draw the picture and they don't explain, well, how does this miracle happen? We understand how it happens in the left picture, right? That it's not a miracle in the left picture. The high value buyers are the ones willing to pay more than the price, so they go and purchase it. And the low value buyers look at the price and say that's too much, and they're not part of the market. But the price is illegal for the price to do that role on the right-hand picture, so something else has to do it. And there's never an explanation of, well, what's happening there. Now, I actually like the Acemoglu book compared to so many others, not for this picture, but if you turn a couple of pages away from here, they have a discussion empirically of price controls. And that's quite interesting. They talk, I was trying to remember if it was concert tickets. I think it was concert tickets. But anyway, the price was set too low. And they describe a stampede of fans trying to get to be first in line to get the tickets. And first of all, that's empirical, so I like it. And it also, I think, helps us begin to understand what's wrong in this picture. Why doesn't the picture on the right represent a stampede? What's missing or drawn incorrectly if you think stampedes are what happened? Please.
Well, I would say there's a margin that those people who are going to somewhere else probably, because they should be substituting for other goods. Here we don't look at that margin, I guess.
Now, okay, so you said that there's not a margin for people to substitute to other goods. Now, how does that relate to the stampede?
I guess there are two costs to get the good. One of them is the time you pay, and the other one is the price you pay for the ticket. Here we only have one dimension, which is the price.
Yes, there's missing you have kind of the production cost is here, and we see that in the picture, but we don't see the cost of the stampede. Now, you mentioned waiting. That's kind of a classic model that I think can be more reasonable. And the stampede's not waiting, it happens rather quick, but there's some effort. And you might have injuries, and so that'd be one issue here. The other issue is, well, with the stampede, now maybe the people who value it the most stampede the best. But if there's some difference in how you value your good and your capability at stampeding, then you might have some of those low value people getting it and the high value people not getting it. So that's another problem in the picture. But I appreciate the story, the empirical observation, because it gets us thinking about, well, how can we do this better? I don't want to pick on just one person, so I've shown another picture here from another book, Krugman's book. Again, this is typical. He's looking at the market for apartment leases in New York City, and he concludes that, well, a rent control or price ceiling on what you can lease an apartment for will reduce the number of apartments under lease by 200,000. Again, the same story. By some miracle, the 200,000 apartments that aren't leased just happen to be those that were the highest cost and lowest benefit. And no explanation of, by what mechanism does that happen. Now, another prediction, well, let's list the prediction because we are empirical, so maybe I'm criticizing this model, but it ends up fitting the data well. So we want to know, well, what's it going to say about the data? I mentioned one already, the goods received by the high value buyers. The regulation doesn't affect the supply or demand curve. So, and I like Acemoglu for giving us the side-by-side. The supply curve on the left is the same as the supply curve on the right. And the demand curve on the left is the same as the demand curve on the right. That's a prediction. These pictures just show a floor, but hopefully it's clear, and usually the books also treat a ceiling, and the ceiling also reduces the quantity. So both floors and ceilings reduce the quantity. Again, that's something we can check empirically. Another prediction is that demand is irrelevant for determining the quantity in this market. So you look in Krugman's picture, if there were to be an increase in the demand for New York apartments, the number of apartments would still be 1.8 million. So going back to the miracle, I'm afraid, is an intermittent miracle. It's a miracle, you get the miracle when deciding who gets the goods versus who doesn't. That's the high value buyers. But the miracle disappears. Somehow that communication that happens that tells the sellers, give it to these guys, they have a high value, don't give it to those guys, they have a low value. That communication ceases when the buyers have a change in their value. They cannot communicate in any way to the sellers, you know, I value this more than we did before. So that's an intermittent miracle. Another prediction is that if supply were in markets with elastic supply, there's a lot of applications where we think supply is pretty elastic, a price ceiling can wipe out the entire market. Even if it's not that far from the unregulated price, wipe out the entire market, despite, the way I've drawn it here, despite the fact that that market was giving us lots of surplus. And you know, that ought to raise your price theory antenna when we talk about the gains from trade. Are people really going to give up that easily? They're getting all this green surplus, and then a rule comes along and asks them to make a rather small change in some sense, and they just give up and say, okay, I really like that market, but I'll just do without it. I'm skeptical, and we ought to be skeptical.